Hi, so today we're going to look at our suspension assessment, which involves removing, refitting a coil spring strut assembly from the front of the car. We're going to look at the different types, different fixtures, explore the different tools required, talk about some of the safety features that you need to think about before doing this job, because it is probably the most dangerous job you could attempt on a car. You think about the weight of the car sitting on those springs, they're under tension, and you've got to release that tension safely. You can see I'm going to be working in both areas, in the wheel arch and over the top of the wing into the engine bay. So normally you'd be fitting a wing cover just to protect the paintwork from any scratches or damage that you might cause the car. For the rest of filming purposes though, so we can see good access, I'm going to have that wing recover removed. First decision you've got to make is, how is this strut assembly attached to the vehicle? There are a couple of options that manufacturers use on the top mount here, as you can see, and also on the bottom mount, which we'll look at in a moment. So first of all, looking at this top mount, you can see that in the middle here we've got one bolt, and then around the outside we've got three smaller bolts. This particular design, to remove the strut from the car, it's the outer three bolts that you undo. This centre bolt is there to retain the spring. So if you made the mistake of undoing this centre bolt to start with, then the whole strut assembly would explode whilst still fitting to the car. So it's really important that you're able to recognise the difference between how the strut is held into the car. So just as a reminder, if it's a single nut in the middle and bolts around the outside, it's the three or two retaining bolts on the outside that you undo. I'll show you an example of the other type in a moment. Okay, so here you can see an example of the other type of top mount that you'd come across. This has got just a single bolt in the middle, a single nut in the middle, nothing around the outside. So this example would be removed from the top. So when you've only got the single nut assembly visible from the top, sometimes it may be covered with some kind of shield or something like that. So once that's removed and you can only see one big nut, nothing around the outside, then it's safe to undo that single large nut on its own. The next decision you have to make is, how is the strut assembly attached to the hub? In this example, we've got a single bolt at the back here which acts like a pinch bolt. So the damper assembly, the strut, Macpherson strut assembly, fits into the hub. It's got a split at the back here, and it's effectively in two halves, and we've got a bolt which acts, as I said, like a pinch bolt and just clamps that strut and the damper into the hub. So if you have this as an example, this is probably the best way to remove it, is simply to undo that bolt, spread the hub and lift the damper out of this hub. And there are other methods used which I'll show you in a moment. Okay, so here you can see another very common method of attaching the Macpherson strut to the hub assembly. We've got two bolts here that go through and effectively clamp the hub assembly into the strut. The one thing to be kind of aware of here is that this is potentially a way that manufacturers would adjust camber angle on this wheel. So I would suggest, if you're faced with a job like this, that you undo just the lower bolt and remove it before you loosen the top bolt. If this lower bolt has a slot rather than a hole, then that means that you have adjustable camber, and you need to mark this hub as a connection so that you can reproduce the correct amount of camber when you reassemble it before you loosen the top. Otherwise you will lose the camber adjustment. Alternatively, put it back together, reset the camber using a camber gauge. There is a third type, which I haven't got an example, but I've come back to this Peugeot to kind of try and explain a difference. It looks very similar to this. The only difference is that bolt is missing, it's not there. And what that means is that the hub assembly and the damper assembly is one unit. So if you need to change the spring or change the shock absorber unit within this tube, then you need to remove the whole hub as well, which obviously means separating the lower suspension system, the brakes, the drive shaft, and so it's a lot more work involved. but they're not the most common setup. Usually they are one of the two previous examples. Okay, so as you can see, we're going to make a start now. I've already got the car on the ramp, I've already taken the wheel off, and I've got the bonnet up. So all your usual precautions about removing the wheel, ramp safety, locating the vehicle correctly on the ramp, and everything you've learned already has been used to get to this stage already. So I've got the wheel off, as I've said. The first job I would always do is just release the steering joint to break the track rod end. It's not essential to get the strut assembly off, but I just find it gives you more manoeuvrability with the hub, and just makes life a little bit easier. So it's one of these examples where doing a little bit more work actually makes your life simpler. This is nothing new. You've done this before when you did your tracking and your steering systems. So I've just broken that track rod end there, just released the joint, the taper. Just going to take the nut off, put the nut back on so I don't lose it, and then I can crack on with removing the actual damper. It's always good practice whenever you're working in any particular zone on a car to just have a look around the area that you're working for other problems, either trying to prevent issues in the future, or maybe even finding additional work which perhaps hasn't been noticed. Here you can see an example. The CV boot on the drive shaft is split. You can see the grease all shiny in the light there, so that grease is escaping. Very dangerous. Potentially that grease get onto the brake disc just here and cause all sorts of problems with the braking. It's also an MOT failure. Up here you can see that this is the anti-roll bar drop link. That's insecure. That's not attached at to the top end. So again, that's something to look at and maybe report on your job card. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is work down at the wheel area. I'm going to release the damper from the hub and just leave it dangling. Then I'm going to lower the car down, and then I'm going to tackle the top half, which will allow me then to, once it's released from the top, just to pull the whole strut assembly out of the wheel arch. So I've gone back to this Peugeot. As you can see, it's just a simple pinch bolt idea, and you can see the split in the back of the hub, which is clamping the damper assembly and strut assembly in place. So I'm just going to release that bolt. I'm going to use a chisel as a wedge and just open that joint up, which will just release the tension. I've already removed the steering arm, as you saw, and then that should just allow me to push down on the hub assembly, and the lower arm should come down, and that should pull the damper out of the hub. Using a knuckle bar, breaker bar, because I'm expecting this bolt to be quite tight, and but let me just spin this out. So as you can see, I've got the bolt out. I've hammered a largest chisel into that groove, which has now acted like a wedge, and if I give this a bit of a wiggle, hopefully we can see, yep, you can see how that's now loose, and it's actually now sliding down out of that hub. So that should now just hopefully drop out. There she is. It's nice and loose now. So now I've got the bottom half released from the hub assembly. Just come back up top now to undo the top half of the strut assembly. As previously shown, I've identified the 3 securing bolts here around the outside, so I'm going to leave the middle one. That's the one that's holding the spring together, so that'll be released in the spring compressor later on. So I'm just going to whiz these 3 out now. Okay, so down to the last bolt. So what I'm going to do, I've got one hand underneath just holding and supporting the damper. I'm going to take the last bolt out, and then that will release the damper, and then I can just remove it through the wheel arch, just ensuring that I'm not going to catch any of the pipework or cables down below. I just want to run through some of the equipment that would be used at various different types of spring compressors. We have 3 here at college. I'll show you all 3 and talk about the pros and the cons of them all. Okay, so this first one is a hydraulic press. It's a very easy and simple operation, works in the same process as a hydraulic jack. You have different size cups that you can choose. The idea is they are shaped and they have little cutouts in them so that the spring locates nicely in that groove to stop the whole component from moving while it's under compression. This example's also got a safety chain, so that if the spring did escape whilst you were working on it, it would be caught by the chain and not fly across the workshop, potentially causing injury. When you're using something like this, you want to try and get the cups as far apart as you can, so you can control as many of the coils in the spring as possible. This example is perhaps one of the better ones. It's a more convenient method, still quite a safe method. You've got it positively locked in the vise, the tool's not going to go anywhere. We've got good clamps around the coil. Again, when you're using this one, try and get as many of the coils in between the cups as you can, and you simply just turn this nut that you can use a ratchet or a spanner for, and that will bring these cups closer together and eventually compress the spring. I'll show you it in action when we strip one down. This is our third choice, which is perhaps my least favourite. It's more of a DIY version than a professional choice. You've got a pair of hooks which are on screw threads. Again, you have an option of how to control these. You can spin them with a spanner or a socket drive in the end here. And basically you work these in a pair, and you evenly try and compress these hooks to squash the spring as much as you possibly can. But these are perhaps the least safe and certainly not my favourite. When using these hooks, you can see I've secured the damper unit, the strut assembly, in the actual vise, and I've put the tube of the damper in the vise jaws. Now that's perhaps the wrong way to do it, because there is the potential to over tighten the vise and potentially crush that tube, and inside that tube is the whole mechanism which makes the shock absorber work, and then you may damage that unit even though you're perhaps only changing the spring. So a better way of fixing the strut into the vise is to undo the vise, drop it down into kind of the curved section of the vise, just do it up lightly, just with one finger, doesn't need to be tight. In fact, it's still loose in the vise, but the vise is still holding that strut assembly in place, and you've got no chance of squashing or damaging the tube of the damper. Okay, so now I've got the spring into the compressor on the bench. The compressor is now secured in the vise, not too tight, so it will still move the thread section, but just making sure that the spring is retained properly in the cups. I've got as many of the coils captured between the cups as possible, and the spring is retained within the safety features, those little lips on those cups, so it's going to lock it into place to prevent that spring from escaping. Okay, so now I'm just going to continue to screw this clamp down, watching to make sure that the spring is secure all the time. When you're working with this equipment, you want to make sure that you're not standing anywhere near the spring. If you're at this end or looking down over the top, these are the potential areas where that spring could escape from. So you always want to be standing to the side of the spring, away from any kind of potential direction it might escape from, working at arm's length really until you're happy and that the spring is properly compressed and retained. So I'm just going to wind this down now until the cups touch and the actual coils are pretty much coil bound, so they're virtually touching, and that'll give me as much compression as I need. As you can see now, the cups are pretty much together, the spring is compressed. During that compression, as you're using the machine, if you hear any kind of odd noises or something you're not sure about, then stop and release the pressure and reassess the spring. Don't just keep going and going and hoping for the best, because that's how mistakes and accidents can happen. So now I'm at a condition where I feel quite safe that this spring is under control. The damper is loose within that spring, and there's no pressure at all on this top mount. So I can now release that top mount, and I could then replace the damper, change the spring, change the top mount, whatever the job requires. Okay, so here you can see a close-up of the top mount area. The actual retaining nut is quite down, recessed within this top mount itself, so a normal socket would be ideal, but of course what's going to happen is as you turn that nut, you can see that the whole thing is actually rotating, so I can't really undo the nuts. I've got to kind of hold the centre bit, which means I can't use a normal socket. So this is an ideal sort of spanner shape to get down inside that recess to undo the nut, whilst we're actually holding the centre with typically an Allen key or maybe a Torx drive or something like that. So it's just a question now of working out which way you need to turn this thing to actually undo. And now you can see that I'm actually holding the centre shaft and undoing that nut, and it's just a question now of undoing this all the way to release the top mount and remove the damper and leave the spring in the compressor. Okay, so I'm at the point now where that nut is just about to release, and before I take the last few threads off, I'm just going to have another double check just to make sure that this is totally released, no pressure whatsoever at all. I can quite happily wobble that with my fingers, so I'm convinced now that this spring is completely, pressure is completely released. I can now release this, and that will then remove all the components for that top mount. Okay, so let's just remove this. Again, I'm still working to the side of it just in case something nasty happens, but I'm pretty sure it won't. And I'm going to lay these components out on the bench in the sequence that they actually come off. So I've got the securing nut, I've then got the washer, which I've just dropped, I've got the recessed cup, I've then got one half of that top mount, which goes down in the orientation that it comes off. I've got this underlying collar as well, that goes down, and then that top mount comes off. And within that top mount you can see that's the bearing which allows the suspension to rotate as part of the steering. Now you can see that the spring and the damper is completely free, so I can remove the damper if I wanted to, if that needs replacing, or then I can now release the spring, swap the spring over for the new one, and then rebuild the strut. You can also see on the damper is the bump stop, which is a rubber component there to reduce the impact of severe bumps and prevent metal to metal contact and damage in the strut. Okay, so I've now put the component back together again, simply just rebuilt that top mount in this reverse sequence that you saw all the parts coming off. A couple of important things to point out. A little bit of lubrication would be used on that bearing just to keep it nice and free, because it's in quite a nasty position, lots of road dirt and muck being thrown up by the wheel. So you want to try and keep that bearing nice and clean as possible and lubricated. And making sure that that spring is sitting against that edge. So that top mount has got a stop, as you can see, so that needs to be mounted against that stop just there. And there's another corresponding stop in the spring catcher down at the bottom. So if I just pan around there, you should be able to see the spring catcher down at the bottom, and just inside there, there is another stop for that bottom coil to sit into. Okay, so the top mount is now all back in place. It's free to rotate at the moment, even though it's not under pressure. I'll check that it still is free in a moment, but it's all back together again. Now I'm just going to release that spring pressure, just guiding the spring back into the two stops that I mentioned earlier. And finally, before I release the spring from the clamp, I'm just going to double check that nothing's moved up this end and that the nut is still in place, so the spring is still going to be held by the top mount, and then give a final twist to that top mount to make sure the steering bearing held in there is free and isn't graunchy or jammed up. Okay, so I'm just releasing the spring pressure at the moment now. As you can see, I'm just making sure that as I twist that spring catcher, it just stops and hits the bottom of the spring, so I know it's located within its proper kind of stop area. And as I just release this pressure all the way through now, I'm just double checking that everything is located and safe to carry on with. Okay, so as you can see now, the spring is completely released from the clamp. The clamp's still in place, so if anything was to happen, it would still catch that spring, but the pressure is now off and that spring is safely retained. Just double checking inside here, you can see that there's still plenty of thread, so the nut's not been stripped, it's not been pushed off the shaft, and it's safe to go back onto the car. Final check with the steering bearing, there it is, you can still turn that nice and freely, so there's nothing graunchy in there, and that shouldn't give us a problem when it's back on the car. Okay, so here we are back at the car. I've got the strut that I'm going to put back on. Now, a couple of things to consider. When you're changing the spring, if you were stripping it down for any other reason, that's fine, but if the spring's being changed because it's damaged, then you need to consider how that spring goes back on. We've already mentioned in previous lessons about progressive springs. This particular spring is a linear compression spring, so it's a parallel one. If it was a progressive spring, it might have a top and a bottom, so you have to get it around the right way. This one, as I said, it doesn't appear to be a progressive one, but it has got these paint marks, which is used to identify the strength of the spring. Consequently, if I was replacing this spring, I would ensure that I put the paint marks in the same place as the old one, so down at the bottom, just in case there was any kind of orientation that I wasn't aware of on that spring. But apart from that, it's now good to go back in the car. Okay, I just wanted to point something out here at the moment before I put the strut back into the car, and that's the fact that it's not a symmetrical alignment, and this particular one has got a peg used to locate this correctly within the wheel arch. And you can see the peg just there, right next to one of the bolt holes that was used to mount it, and that's the two corresponding holes within the wing. So it's really important that you put the pin back in its matching hole. That just keeps the orientation of the mount correct within that top wheel arch. Okay, so from now on, it's basically just a reversal of what you've seen already. So I've got one hand in the wheel arch. I'm just keeping that top mount located. There's the peg going into its locating hole, and I've just put one bolt in place just to kind of locate it. Now it's going to keep it quite safe. I've got the load off as it's held in by the rest of the bolts, and it's just a question of putting this back together at the top now. Okay, so as you can see, the top half of the strut now is mounted back into the wheel arch. If you had access to torque figures, this is when you'd apply the torque to these top mounts, so you can finish that half of the job. As you saw from the strip down, I haven't torqued up this centre nut. It's not often a figure that you're able to access, and certainly on the bench you couldn't torque it up anyway because the whole thing would spin. If you have got a torque figure for this top bolt, you'd have to do that when you've finished the whole job and the whole strut is controlled by the wheel and it's back on the road, on the surface, so it won't rotate, and then you could apply the torque figure to this top mount if you had one. Okay, so I've got the strut now sort of sat close to where it needs to go back into the hub. Just want to point out a couple of things to you. You can clearly see, as this is the old original damper, you've got the clean area, and you can clearly see where the hub sits against the damper. If this was a new damper, you wouldn't have those witness marks, as they are called, but the manufacturer does provide means to tell you how far in that damper needs to fit, and there are little kind of ridges just there which will stop the damper going too far down. So long as you push the two parts together so that this hub hits that ridge, you know this is pushed in far enough. Otherwise you could upset the ride height of the vehicle if this is not in far enough, or perhaps gone too far, and you'd have the vehicle sitting low on one side. The other thing to think about is this slot here, that kind of clamp effect that we mentioned earlier. There's an orientation notch just there, so that's got to fit in that top section so that you know you've got the twist and you haven't got that kind of spun around the wrong way. Okay. So once you're happy that you've got the damper kind of orientated correctly within the space for the hub, it's just a question of pushing the two bits together in this design. Sometimes that can be a bit awkward, a bit heavy, and you know, you need perhaps an extra pair of hands. If you're working by yourself, then I would recommend using this transmission jack, which is positioned just underneath that lower ball joint, and I can apply some upward pressure onto that ball joint to push the hub into the damper. The only thing to consider is that when you're working this area here and you're pushing on the pump and it's lifting the hub into the damper, is that if you don't watch what you're doing and you lift this hub too much, you can actually lift the vehicle off the ramp. So it's very important that you are watching both areas when you're doing this, making sure the car's not moving off the ramp, but you've still got that pressure lifting up. If it starts to lift the car, obviously stop and reassess. There's a reason why it's not going back together. It doesn't take that much pressure to push the damper and hub assembly back together. Okay, as you can see, I've got the damper into the hub. It's not quite finished off. I'm just going to put a squirt of duck oil on there just to make sure it slides in quite nicely. You don't need masses of the duck oil. I've also reused the wedge just to spread that hub to give myself a little bit more easy life. Just going to push this up now and just hopefully get that to position, and then I might just have to give that a little bit of a twiddle and a little bit of a pump, and you can see now how that's gone back in nicely. It's back down to where it was. It's on those little ridges, so it's back in the correct ride height now, I've just got to finish the job off with putting the pinch bolt back in after taking that chisel out. Okay, so pretty much done now. Everything's back in place down in the wheel arch area. Just a couple of things to finish off. Just wanted to sort of point out again that the fact that the way we did the job meant that we didn't have to strip down the hub, the brakes. We haven't disturbed anything down here. I just made sure that the damper, as I removed it, didn't catch any of the wires or the hoses and perhaps damage those, but they didn't have to be removed, so it really cut down on the work to do. I've just now got to reattach the steering track rod end, which just simply pops up like that. What I will do is just going to put a little bit of upward pressure on that ball joint with the transmission jack, just to keep that taper engaged and to stop that thread from spinning, so I can get the nut started and then tightened up. And then I would, of course, reattach the drop link for the anti-roll bar that I showed you was broken earlier. Obviously I've replaced this and then reattach it back into its location, which is just there. Okay, so 2 more bolts to do. And then I had to torque up the track rod end, torque up the drop link, and of course torque up the pinch bolt for the damper into the hub. And then it's just a question of the wheel back on, torqued up the wheel bolts, and you're pretty much finished. Okay, so that's pretty much the job done now. Just finishing off torquing up the wheel, as you can see. I would have torqued up, as I said, all the track rod end and the pinch bolt, as I said earlier. So job's pretty much done. So that's it. That's the 154 suspension strut assessment complete. So this is something you would now be expected to complete by yourselves. Okay, thank you.